back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. As most, if not all of you know by now, Marianne Williamson, best-selling author, is once again running for the presidency. She is challenging Joe Biden in the Democratic primaries for the 2024 election. And she joins us now to talk about her candidacy and her newly announced economic platform. So without any further ado, because there's a lot to cover, Marianne Williamson, welcome back to the Zero Hour.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Well, let's get this part of it out of the way. Since you've announced that your candidacy, I've observed a couple cycles in the coverage of it and the response to it. The first was dismissive, I guess I would say, as in almost that it was impertinent for someone to challenge Joe Biden for the presidency. Certainly most elected progressive Democrats have already indicated they'll support him, and so on. And secondly, with the entry of Robert Kennedy Jr. into the race, it seems now that the media maybe has someone else to pick on, and they're calling him the Trump candidate or such things as that. Nevertheless, she perseveres, and you're carrying on, and you are, in fact, as I see it, gaining some traction. For one thing, you're doing very well on social media, like TikTok. You are a presence in the polls, and I guess I would remind listeners, perhaps, I haven't gone back and checked, perhaps even more of a presence than Bernie Sanders was at the same time in the 2016 presidential cycle. So there's that. But I wanted to, address this directly with you, because most people I talk to, certainly here in Washington, D.C., they said, well, she's not a serious candidate, but who is or isn't a serious candidate is generally not decided by a few. So I wanted to get your thoughts on the response. First of all, the insider response, and then the public response to your candidacy so far.
There's a term you've probably heard, contempt prior to investigation. And I was so clear that that was what was going on in 2020. People who have never read my book, who came up with this idea of the woo-woo crystal lady, the crazy lady, all of that stuff. And that, of course, has carried over. It's interesting to me that my background in the realm of spirituality is somehow problematical. We had Reverend Jesse Jackson run for president. Nobody complained about that. Reverend Al Sharpton ran for president. No one claimed, no one had a problem with that. And anyone who actually reads my books, as you're probably aware, sees that I come from actually a pretty traditional place, an ecumenical place, but a pretty traditional place in terms of what my books are about, discussing universal spiritual themes. Also, my book, starting with my book, Healing the Soul of America in 1998, have been about serious political topics. I was talking about the corporatocracy in a book that came out in 1998, and corporations running the country. I was talking about reparations and racial disparities and systemic racism. So there was this myth, really. It's a part of a smear. She's just this, I love it when people say it's a vanity project, because this is such an assault on one's vanity. You can't even imagine. And also, then there was the one about a grift, and I'd like to know what the grift is, because I'll tell you something. In my field, the books that I write, the way to make money, people say she's doing it to sell books. The way to make money, if that's what you're after as a writer, in my field, is to never mention politics. The last thing that this has done for me is helped me commercially. So this caricature began to be created, and it is unbelievable to me almost. Some of the people who think of themselves as so sophisticated and are so easily disinformed when it comes to me. A lot of people wouldn't agree with my policies, and that I certainly understand. Although the thing that's been interesting to me, Richard, is how many people do agree with the policies I'm putting forth, but just have a problem. There's something about me. That's been difficult to take on a personal level. But with this time around, I have a thicker skin because you develop some emotional antibodies. At this point, I'm almost curious about it. from an almost Jungian perspective. Like, what the hell? This is like the 15th century. She's dangerous. She's crazy. Ooh, she's a mean witch. I mean, really, misogyny is alive and well. I mean, this is kind of amazing. This whole, it's almost like she's a witch, she's a witch, she's a witch. It's become she's a bitch, she's a bitch, she's a bitch. And I see how there's someone in the race, and I don't want to go into it because there's nothing personal about any of this, who says some outrageously not left-wing things and is given a pass. And I say something on a tweet in 2018, and she's a Zionist or whatever. So, yeah, it's quite something. But I see it as just part of the turbulence of a presidential campaign. In the U.S. Constitution, it's interesting to me that it says that in order to run for president, you have to be 35 years old or over. You have to have lived here for 14 years. You have to have been born here. It does not say you have to have been a lawyer or a governor or a senator or a congressperson. If they wanted to say that, the founders would have. And the reason they didn't is because they wanted every generation to be able to decide for itself. What are the qualities? What are the requirements for adequate leadership at this time? I feel the career I have had is very serious. Thank you. These people say I'm not serious. Excuse me? When I have spent as many years at the deathbeds of people dying, this idea that I'm not serious, these are people who have no idea what I've done with my life. I'll tell you what I'm serious about. I'm serious about the fact that 1 in 4 Americans have medical debt. I'm serious about the fact that this planet is blowing up and we're ramping up rather than ramping down fossil fuel extraction. I'm serious about the fact that half of America's seniors live on less than $25,000 a year. I'm serious about the fact that we have the highest poverty rate of any nation, any other advanced democracy. So once again, of course, they say I'm not serious. What they're really, and I'm not qualified. What I'm qualified to do is to disrupt their little perch. So they would have us believe that only someone who's one of them could drive us out of the ditch that they drove us into. And now I'm dangerous because I'm dangerous to that little perch. This is not personal, but I feel that even though we clearly have an authoritarian threat, we have a neo-fascist threat. And some people would say, how could you run? Don't you understand the fascists are at the door? I'm running because I do understand the fascists are at the door. And I understand one of the reasons the fascists are at the door is because while neo-fascism is attacking us from the outside, neoliberalism has eroded our democracy from the inside. And that neoliberal view, even the highest, best aspect of it, I guess, which is you try to help some people sometimes, is not going to be enough to counter the big lies that are going to be coming at us in 2024. So I happen to believe that only solid, real, fundamental economic reform is a real economic U-turn, is going to compensate for the extraordinary lack of economic justice and all the societal justice that emerges from that is now imbued into our system. If somebody wants to think that's serious, they can think it, but I think that's a very, very serious topic indeed. And somebody saying I'm not a serious woman, I get to determine. And I think that based on what I've done with my life over the last 40 years, any objective view of it, while somebody might not agree, nobody would look at what I've done with my life and call it not serious.
Well, there's a lot to unpack in that, Marianne Williamson, including, I think to a certain extent, if you don't mind my saying that, you fall in victim to, there's a kind of tribalism of she's not one of us. You fall victim to that. I think the gender issue is very real. I think the witch part is very real too. The combination of being a woman and having this association with spirituality. The people who are not uncomfortable with Martin Luther King Jr. being associated with spirituality. And, not if anyone gets offended, it's not necessarily that I'm comparing the two of you, but you understand what I'm saying, that it all comes together in a way. And to me, it was instructive, and then we can move on to the issues, but to me, it was instructive to read the article about you by Chris Lehman I assume you saw it in The Nation the other day.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting article.
Well, I did too, and I thought what was interesting about it was I could see Chris kind of wrestling with himself a little bit. He starts with this premise. I think he headlined it, Marianne Williamson from Third Way to Third Eye. And I thought, oh boy, but then he's saying, well, what would Barbara Ehrenreich think? She's the great left-wing journalist who died recently, and journalist for the working class, about being cited and quoted by Marianne Williamson. Then he kind of says, well, she'd probably kind of like the spiritual stuff too, because Barbara wrote a book about her own spiritual...
witches. Barbara Ehrenreich wrote a book about the witches. It's a book about what happened when the early, what came later, of course, to be a completely Christianity-dominated industrial, all of that age that we think of as starting with the Enlightenment, etc. The destruction of the so-called witches, because the early dispensation of medical doctors didn't want these women around who just knew what to do with the herbs and knew what to do with the seeds and knew what to do that weren't within what was becoming the scientific model of that time. And also those women were talking about a partnership with nature at a time when that early dispensation of Christianity was talking about how God had given nature to man to use for his purposes, his utilitarian purposes. Barbara Ehrenreich wrote a book about that. And like you said, Martin Luther King was a Baptist preacher, and many of the leaders of the suffragist movement were Quakers, and much of the abolitionist movement emerged from the early evangelical churches in New Hampshire. So you can just deny history or revise history, but the truth of the matter is the greatest social justice movements in this country and some of the greatest left-wing thinkers, such as Barbara Ehrenreich, absolutely had a grounding in a more expansive perspective than the simply Western materialistic one.
And conversely, a lot of the people I think who are defending the current system, which is exclusively materialistic in its philosophical foundation, are the ones most vehement about, attacking people like you entering politics, because that dimension doesn't exist in that kind of technocratic view of the world, I think. Would you think that's fair to say?
No, I would say that there's only recently, Richard. You and I grew up in a time when there was a solid religious left. The William Sloane Coffin and the Berrigan brothers during the Vietnam War. Bobby Kennedy was the one who said, this is all for the soul of the nation. Dr. King said, Martin Luther King said, it's time to inject a new dimension of love into the veins of our civilization. He said, we need quantitative shifts in our circumstances and qualitative shifts in our souls. So it's only been this more recent over-secularized. It comes from a kind of neo-Marxist perspective. I understand a class analysis and the finances of it all, but I don't even think it's true. If you read early Marx, he was a great humanitarian philosopher. I don't even think Karl Marx would be rolling his eyes at times. He was against religion. He talks about organized religion and the specter that is haunting, all of that clearly. And I'm not speaking from a perspective of institutional organized religion. There was more even to Karl Marx than simply class analysis. He talked more broadly about the human condition. I know he did because I read those books.
Yeah, he talked about the human need for spirituality and higher values. He objected to what he called the religion is the opiate of the masses.
That religion, not spirituality. And when you think of what religion was at that time, very different than what I'm talking about. He was a feminist, actually. The things he wrote about women in his early humanitarian philosophical works.
Well, let's pivot. This is so fascinating for me personally, but I do think that as we go forward, you have just articulated in more depth an economic platform using as a foundation Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights that he articulated during his presidency. We've talked about that on this program with historian Harvey Kay and activist Alan Minsky and others. So it's something our listeners are familiar with. If you would, tell us what you see as important about having an economic bill of rights and articulating that such a thing at this moment in history?
First of all, just the word history. I think we have to reclaim the American story. I think many people on the right only want to talk about what America has done right and have no interest in looking at the deep shadows and the terrible mistakes and even crimes of this country. But on the other hand, I think sometimes people on the left only want to talk about what we've done wrong and have no listening for the ways in which we have at least tried to get it right and sometimes have succeeded in doing so. I think both sides are missing the point. So the first thing that matters to me is that you reclaim the American story. If you look at the signing of the Declaration of Independence, 1776, the pillars of the Declaration to me are America's mission statement. Whether you're an individual, an organization, or a country, when you have a mission statement, these are the things on which we all agree to agree, and it's extremely important. And there are four main principles in the Declaration of Independence that are that. Number one, that all men are created equal. Number two, that God gave all men inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Number three, that governments are instituted to secure those rights. And number four, if government isn't doing its job, then it's the right of the people to alter it or abolish it. That should be our North Star. That's why John Adams said he wanted us to revisit the first principles every year. If you make the Declaration of Independence your North Star, this country has done fine. When and if we deviate, ignore, or abandon the principles of the Declaration of Independence, that's when we have faltered. And we're obviously faltering now. Now, Lincoln saw the Declaration of Independence as the moral basis that all men are created equal, saw that as the moral basis for the emancipation of the slaves and the fighting of the Civil War, in the sense that it was a stand, not only that Southern states couldn't leave, but that Southern states could not, or any states could not hold enslaved people. That was number one. Then, and then, of course, he also passed the Land Grant Act in 1862, where for the first time, the government actually, through the appropriation of land to be used for public universities and colleges for the children of workers and farmers, was saying, yes, the government should use its resources to help you. Now, then comes along Roosevelt, who in the 30s, he talked about the four freedoms. He said, not only is it the freedoms of speech, the freedom of religion, he said there's a freedom from want and from fear. So he, once again, these men took very, very seriously those lines: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And so Franklin Roosevelt, much like Lincoln, one of the great tragedies, two of the great tragedies of U.S. history, and of course this applies also to Bobby Kennedy, it applies also to Martin Luther King. Some of our greats have been killed at almost when we needed them the most. So Lincoln had, I don't know if you could say the most in terms of Lincoln and Roosevelt, but in both cases, Lincoln and Roosevelt, these men were making plans for what was going to happen after the war, right? So Lincoln was shot shortly after the surrender at Appomattox. And of course, Roosevelt died just like a month before the surrender. So in both cases, they were making plans for what would happen afterwards. And Roosevelt had put the word out to the American people. What do you want America to be at the end of the war? We've made it through the Depression. We've made it through World War II. What do you want this country to be? They didn't have what we would call today polls, but they had ways of finding out. And the American people said to Franklin Roosevelt, basically, they wanted everything. They wanted universal health care. They wanted free college. He got the GI Bill passed, but he wanted it to be universal education for everyone. He couldn't get those Southern racist senators to agree to that. But just look at how the GI Bill, which allowed those returning veterans to go to college, look what that did to create America's middle class, which we had until the 1970s, right? So think what it would have been if he had said everyone can have that. So here he said, he looked at the American people. What do they want? They wanted housing. They wanted education. They wanted jobs. They wanted health care. They wanted banking safety, that their financial transactions would be secure. They wanted justice. And so his idea was, we're going to give it to you. You just fought World War II. The American people deserve everything. Even when we talk now about a living wage, there's a quote where Roosevelt said he didn't think any business in America that didn't pay its workers a living wage even had a right to exist in this country. Now, the problem, of course, is that Roosevelt would be considered a crazy left-winger today. I don't even think he'd be allowed into the Democratic Party. But I think what the Democratic Party needs to do is to return to the vision of Roosevelt. So the idea of an economic bill of rights, it wasn't, it's kind of like a new Green Deal in the sense that it's a resolution. It's a set of principles. It's not saying how this would all be accomplished, but you embrace it as the goal. And even though the economic bill of rights was not able to be, there was nothing codified or realized in his lifetime because of course, his death, it's something which has never totally gone away, the idea. So in 1960, the Democratic platform, it was included in the Democratic platform. And Martin Luther King talked about it. And of course, you see echoes of all of this in the modern regeneration of the labor movement. So I've always been fascinated by the fact that basically there are two different ways to live your life. You can live your life just in reaction to circumstances, which is just the way it is in America today, because we're always playing whack-a-mole. What did they do today? Today they banned books. Today they got rid of abortion rights. What they do today, we're constantly playing whack-a-mole, just trying to protect the rights that have been so hard won in this country. Every generation should be expanding the franchise of democratic rights and opportunities. And here there are people trying to shrink them. One of the ways, the most powerful way to deal with such a time as this is to not just live from circumstances, but to have a vision of what you want. And then when you have a vision of what you want, because of the attitudes that it creates in you, because of the articulation that becomes clear to other people, it lifts the circumstances and makes it easier to achieve a goal. And that's why I laid out a plan for a 21st century economic bill of rights, which is a vision of a moral economy. In my opinion, life does not work, whether it's an individual's life or a nation's life, outside an ethical center. And what I want to do and why I want to be president is to realign public policy with the deepest dimension of the human experience. You have economists and politicians who huddle together, talk about data and accounting and statistics. They don't have a freaking clue what the single mother of two out there trying to make ends meet is going through. And if you ask them, they would just see her story as some anecdotal nothing. Well, not me. I think, you cannot have an economics so devoid of a moral dimension of reverence and responsibility to human beings. But that's what neoliberalism is. And that system is not going to disrupt itself. And I think it has to be someone from the outside. And that's why I'm running for president.
Marianne Williamson, going back to the four freedoms, which are, the foundation of that moral economy you've been describing. Freedom from fear, for example.
And freedom from want.
And freedom from want, as well as the freedoms we know. Freedom from want, we understand, but if we unpack a concept like freedom from fear, that you mentioned the single mom trying to raise, let's say, 2 kids, working in a fast food restaurant. Her fears are likely to be numerous. Her fears are likely to be, are they going to change my shift tomorrow and not tell me, and I can't get childcare? If my child gets sick, will I be able to afford it? If bus fares go up, I'm stuck, on and on and on. If my rent goes up, if blah, blah, blah. It's what they call precarity, right? The modern condition of precarity, which is not only for the working poor, but, even people who might be considered working class. The studies of polling showing that people don't have $400 in cash, a majority of people, on hand for a sudden emergency. How do you translate that? How does President Williamson begin? I mean, I know it's a big ask, but how do you begin to translate that into policy that materially affects people's lives?
First of all, you acknowledge it as a national crisis. So we have the highest poverty rate of any advanced democracy. The precarity that you mentioned, you have 70% of Americans who report, according to a new CNBC poll that they live a life that is financially stressed. What are they financially stressed about? Well, if you have 60% of Americans who live paycheck to paycheck, they're afraid of the things that you mentioned. And what does that mean? That means that if I can't pull it together, I'm going to lose my home. We have over 3 million evictions in this country. We now have an eviction level that's higher than during the Great Recession and the real estate bubble. So people are living in constant, chronic economic anxiety. And this constant chronic economic anxiety underlies so many of the societal dysfunctions we have. It underlies a lot of the depression. It underlies a lot of the crime, a lot of the incarceration, a lot of the addiction. People's lives are falling apart, Richard. And that's what my 40-year career has been up close and personal with people's lives that are falling apart. But when I started my career, I saw people living with deep trauma. It was the exception. It wasn't the rule. These days, somebody's life riddled with anxiety seems more the rule than the exception. And you cannot ignore what a huge factor economic injustice plays in all this. Our middle class has been wiped out. So what do you do as president? First thing you do is you cut all U.S. contracts, government contracts, with any union busting company. You make sure that you can pass with an executive order that anybody in the public or the private sector that works for a company that has a contract, a federal contract with the government, will be paid a living wage. We have to move beyond just raising the minimum wage. This is so outrageous. We haven't paid the minimum wage. Even the minimum wage is not a living wage in so many parts of the country that 1/3 of America's workers are living at less than $15 an hour and cannot find a place to live. You can restore, in every single area where I went through in my economic Bill of Rights speech, whether it has to do with housing, you now have Wall Street that is commodifying people's homes. You have something like 600,000 homeless people in the United States. You have 500,000 vacant homes. So you now have Wall Street turning real estate, turning people's homes into a commodity. They shouldn't be able to go out there and just buy whole neighborhoods. They shouldn't be able to go out there first and make it difficult for the American citizen to even buy a home. Well, you can tax those people. You can make it impossible for them to do that. When it comes to the medical debt that people are living in, you pass universal health care. You create a situation as we had until the 1960s and 70s, where there was free college tuition at public colleges and universities and tech school. The president has tremendous power. Now, it's true, the president doesn't have a magic wand. You don't want the president to have a magic wand. But at the same time, there is so much given executive order that the president Roosevelt laid out his economic Bill of Rights, as with so much that he did. Of course, corporations vehemently opposed him. Of course, they yelled socialist. He didn't care. He said, I welcome their hatred. He didn't try to work with those guys. He said you are economic royalists. And that's what you need in a president today. And that's what I would be as president. I would have no problem making them squirm. The only reason you have 18 million Americans who cannot afford to fulfill the prescriptions that their doctors give them. 68,000 people who die every year because of lack of health care. People rationing their insulin for one reason and one reason only, the greed of the insurance industry. There are people putting GoFundMe pages up on the internet in order to pay for their life-saving operations for them or for their children. Why? Only because some greedy, you know what, at an insurance company turned them down for that operation. That will not happen when there's universal health care. And we need a president who will say that. And that is the use of the bully pulpit, so that you can make more Americans come around to the realization, Americans who are now so vulnerable to the canard about, ooh, socialism. My God. And then, or to lines like, how are we going to pay for it? We're paying for it now with our lives. And an $88 billion medical debt. While the top 5 pharmaceutical companies last year alone had an $80 billion profit. The American people have been played. Now, the Democratic Party, theoretically, the party I grew up with, is supposed to be the party of unequivocal advocacy for the working people of the United States. And when that party, which it would, with me as nominee and me as president, returns to those traditional values, then you won't have people so vulnerable to the darkness because they'll be living in the light of a greater understanding. Franklin Roosevelt said we wouldn't have to worry about a fascist takeover in this country as long as democracy delivered on its promises. But democracy is not now delivering on its promises. If democracy were to deliver on its promises, we would have universal health care. We would have free college tuition at public colleges and universities. We would have free childcare. We would have paid family leave. We would have guaranteed sick pay. We would have guaranteed living wage. That is those are moderate positions in every other advanced democracy. They should be moderate positions in our country. And with me as president, you'd have a president who said so and acted on it to the full extent of the executive power that is granted to her.
Last question, if you have time for one more, is, okay, you're on a street corner in Ames, Iowa, or in a VFW hall in McDowell County, West Virginia, or you get the gist of where I'm going with this, right? Or, rural Oklahoma. And you're making your pitch to folks who haven't voted Democratic in a generation, who used to be solidly Democratic, but who are now considered, the red state MAGA hat types. Do you have anything to say to them?
One of the things that I most disrespect about the political system is that it talks to people like they're stupid. And I think that's one of the ways we got here. I've been to Ames, Iowa. I've been to those red states. Remember, I come from Texas. And what I find is that why don't you be honest and truthful with people? And I think a lot of the people that you just mentioned might not realize, in Europe, they have those things. The only reason you don't have them is because of the insurance companies. The only reason you don't have them is because of pharmaceutical companies. The only reason your farm is in trouble is because of big ag. The only reason that food is contaminated is because of big food companies. The only reason that your children probably have all that higher chronic illness rate is because where you live is a sacrifice zone, that petrochemical factory down the road. So many of the contaminants in the food, in the water, in the air. What I find is those people are not stupid. I would simply tell them the truth. I say the same thing whether I'm talking to some rich person on the Upper East Side or some less politically and economically advantaged person in the kinds of places that you're talking about. And I have no problem saying to that rich person on the Upper East Side, you should not even want to create wealth at the expense of other people getting a chance to. And if you continue to, the rabble is closer to the gates of the Bastille than you have any idea. Join with me. This is not gonna ruin your day to pay 2% more if you have $550 million in the bank, and it's certainly not going to ruin your day to pay 1% more if you have $1 billion. Come on, be real. And I find nods heading in both of those groups. There's a basic decency, I believe this, at the center of the American, but we don't see it on display in terms of political force because no one's speaking to it anymore. And that should be the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party thinks it needs to come up with better messaging. No, the Democratic Party needs to come up with better policies.
Well, on that note, I know how busy a presidential campaign is, Marianne Williamson, or I try to keep you longer, but ethics prevents that on my part. So Marianne Williamson, author and presidential candidate, thanks so much for the time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard. I so appreciate it.
Absolutely. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and you're listening to The Zero Hour.